We attended to her. After much prayer, we want to praise God that she was delivered from spiritual oppression. Western Christian versus African traditional approaches. These two are diametrically at odds. So often, African traditional approaches to health and wholeness are really misconstrued, squandered, dismissed, if not treated as passe. But why? Western medicine, lush with advances in medical, laboratory, and pharmaceutical technology, tend to ignore traditional medicine as archaic, superstitious, and non-scientific. The mainstream Christian religion tends to see everything demonic in the practice of African traditional medicine. But is it true that as far as the ATM is concerned, nothing good can come from Nazareth? More questions. Considering the fact that Africans, including indigenous communities the world over, from time immemorial have used ATM, could the allegations that it has been of no medicinal and healing value wholesale be correct? How do we explain the resilience of ATM, even to this era of most advanced medical technology? While these questions have been relegated to the medical anthropologist, it might be a good idea to consider their findings. It also suffices to say a closer look at ATM might prompt a paradigm shift in the minds of those who have diminished or completely dismissed it. I must pose my disclaimer. By posing these questions, I do not suggest ATM can be embraced and practiced wholly without caution for its side effects, perceived malpractice, and biblical issues that may arise. The point at stake here is whether there is something of value in ATM that Western medicine could effectively adapt. One of the best ways to understand the place of TM is to look at the epistemological arguments behind its adverse rejection. So let's look at the concepts of health and wholeness. There are two entities that will give us a window to the questions that have been raised earlier: the World Health Organization and also the Western Christian medical system. We have already seen from the previous presenters the statement about health from the World Health Organization: physical, mental, social well-being not being the absence of disease or infirmity. The World Health's definition has for decades guided Western medical approach, research, and practice. The goal of this definition is embedded in the World Health Organization's broad mandate under its constitution to promote the attainment of the highest possible level of health by all peoples. The World Health Constitution, in summary, calls for the enjoyment of the highest attainable health standards as a fundamental right of every human being, for health for all peoples as it is fundamental to their attainment of peace and security. All states to promote and protect the needs of all. Sorry for that typo. I didn't open the latest that I saved in the computer. The sharing with all peoples the benefits of medical, psychological, and related knowledge as essential to the fullest attainment of health. Very good point in the Constitution, but here is a key point. The spiritual is not in the picture. The traditional medicine has no mention at this stage. Yet when we look at Luke chapter 2, verse 52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Verse 40 also gives us an equally complete nuance. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Rick Warren, one of these famous churches for the mega churches, has put it more succinctly. Jesus grew in wisdom, that's mental growth. Stature, that's physical growth. In favor with God, that's spiritual growth. In favor with men, that's social growth. Now, It is significant because traditional medicine is mostly deeply spiritual, so much that any ministry or service to the beneficiaries of this practice may not be worthwhile if it does not appreciate this aspect. The spirituality of the African traditional religion is different from the spirituality of the Christian religion, but that is a beachhead. It can only be a beachhead for the gospel and health workers. Health is the experience of physical and psychological well-being. Good health and poor health do not occur as a dichotomy, but as a continuum. Alan Card is trying to improve or adapt the definition of the World Health Organization. The absence of disease or disability is neither sufficient nor necessary to produce a state of good health. This is more about people who have faith. Even if they are sick, they know they are safe in the arms of Christ. So the word experience, according to Card, is really relevant in the sense that another cannot declare health for a patient, nor can sickness be experienced for another. Those who feel spiritually sick, they need spiritual treatment. Then came the moment of reawakening with the World Health Organization. It would take a unique group of autochthonous peoples, the indigenous, anthropologists, and physicians from many cultural origins to identify and explain several key concepts that World Health Organization should reintegrate into its new definition of health, which is human equilibrium in nature, accepted spirituality, and adaptation. So in its 2014 to 2023 traditional medicine strategy, the World Health Organization urges the member states to harness the potential contribution of traditional medicine to health, wellness, and people-centered healthcare. Secondly, to promote the safe and effective use of traditional medicine by regulating, researching, and integrating traditional medicine products, practitioners, and practice into health systems where appropriate. This is a very good development that speaks volumes to alert Western medicine practitioners and Christian workers who might still be restrictive in their consideration of the use of TM. An important point about any approach to health is that it should balance the physical, the mental, social, and spiritual aspects of humanity. Complementary and traditional medicines, as it is becoming to be known, has this balance, must be carefully, though not necessarily wholesale, looked into. Any meaningful mission or service to the African peoples must be seriously considered, must seriously consider their spirituality and how it plays out in their concept of health and wellness. Let's look at the Western Christian medicine. This has been buoyed by science, reason, and research. The Western medicine has fast become the global core for health and wellness, though it is disproportionate against the global South as it is usually unaffordable. Undeniably, the South ultimately has no choice but to continue with its long and tested practice of traditional medicine. The effectiveness of Western medicine cannot be disputed, with all its technological advances that have saved countless lives. But what is it really that informs Western medicine? The World Health Organization definition for health has certainly set the pace for Western medicine in the last 7 decades. But to the historically minded, it is common fodder that even the World Health Organization has had its predecessors that shaped Western medicine more profoundly. We all might remember the father of medicine, Hippocrates. He was the first to base his practice on the systematic observation and human anatomy. Hippocrates went against the grind when he proposed that disease had a physical and rational explanation, thus rejecting the views of his time that considered illness to be caused by superstitions and by possession of evil spirits and disfavor of the gods. Effectively, it was the beginning of the exclusion of the spiritual from from the psychophysical in the medical treatment of the human being. However, since the time of Hippocrates, nothing much really changed in the worldviews of the world communities until the time of the Enlightenment. This was a time of calls for freedom from feudalism and oppressive Christian church practice. The proponents of the Enlightenment embraced democracy, citizenship, reason, rationality, and the social value of intelligence, the value of information gathering. Reason and rationality subjected theology, tradition, and superstition to serious criticism and rejection. Deity, ancestors, spirits, demons, and many other forms deemed superstitious were pushed out of the society's think tanks and replaced with reason. This is significant in the sense that health, as well as other disciplines, had to be rationalized. This effectively and ultimately led to evidence-based perceptions of health, medicine, and healing, which systematically ruled out all things divine and superstitious. This includes the rejection of traditional medicine, particularly the vast herbal knowledge that has been in use for aeons. So we get posed with some missiological challenges here because of the age of reason. First, the current modern to pre-modern view of health has sustained the World Health Organization definition of health to the exclusion of spiritual health. Second, a natural consequence is the dismissal of prayer as a serious therapeutic practice, particularly in Western medical institutions. Thirdly, rational or evidence-based therapy has dismissed spirit oppression, also known as demon possession, as superstition. And lastly but not least, traditional herbs, which it is biblical to use, also have been rejected without giving a thought to analyzing with the intent of improving them to help the local communities. We have a few biblical passages on herbs, like in Genesis 1:29, where every fruit that yields seed has been given to us for food. And Isaiah 38:21 says, "Let them take a lump of figs and apply it as a poultice on the boil, and he shall recover." Dr. Sikwa, that's from Isaiah. Is there no balm in Gilead? That's the question. Where are the herbs? So along the bank of the river, on this side and that, will grow all kinds of trees used for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear fruit every month because their water flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for medicine. I bumped into this epigram, and I think it is interesting to me. The history of medicine. 2000 BC, here, eat this fruit. 1000 BC, that root is heathen. Here, say this prayer. 850 AD, that prayer is superstitious. Here, drink this portion. 1940 AD, that portion is snake oil. Here, swallow this pill. 1985, that pill is ineffective. Here, take this antibiotic. 2000 AD, that antibiotic doesn't work anymore. Here, eat this fruit. We really can't avoid the herbs. They are God-given. Pharmaceuticals use herbs. Traditional medicine uses herbs. It can only make sense if pharmaceuticals work together with the traditionalists towards improving the use of herbs. We will briefly look at the African traditional versus Western healthcare. Now, across the world, the traditional medicine is either the mainstay of healthcare delivery or serves as a complement to it. In some countries, traditional medicine or non-conventional medicine may be termed as complementary medicine, as we mentioned. ATM is closely tied to African religion. This is why the traditional doctor will be compelled of necessity to consult the ancestors and the spirits. The question of individualism is propagated by the Western philosophy. And the African traditional healthcare system is in many ways different from the Western. The latter, of course, is systematized, rationalized, evidence-based, highly specialized, pharmaceutical, and focuses on the individual's health, whose status is jealously guarded by the practitioner. This individualism is encapsulated in the famous saying of Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." In contrast, the African traditional healthcare is community. This means that it is normal for relatives of the patient and the inner circle of the members of the community to participate in seeking modes of healing for the patient. John Mbiti, one of the great African religious writers, African tradition, says, this sense of community says, I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. There is no individualism with the African community. In other words, I exist because we are. I remember a time when we were studying in Michigan, and one of our church members lost a child. So we went for prayers, and we all drove there, and our vehicles were parked all over, started singing, and the neighbors, who did not know our culture, of course, our Caucasian neighbors there, they called the police. We are under attack. The police came, and they asked questions, and they found that we were doing what's called community therapy. We can't throw away that. It's our culture. We cannot introduce just individual counseling. We have to call one another as Africans. Gospel workers in all disciplines need to take into consideration this African context in order to be of fuller benefit to the African community. It's time for transition. Christian missionaries mostly, though by not all means, denounced herbal medicines as evil, looking on them as pagan because of the close relationship between the herbs and agents of local divinities. At the emergence of the African Independent Church movement at the beginning of the 20th century, herbal medicines acquired a sacramental value, and today they are obtained from churches and local prophets as therapeutic substances infused with spiritual power for healing. There are key differences in the practice, in the philosophy, between African traditional healthcare and Western healthcare. When you look at the illness, from the African tradition, it is a disequilibrium with the environment. The ancestors are not happy. The living dead, those who are departed and now they really haven't gotten to the fourth heaven, as it were. They're still hovering and still supervising. They may not be happy. But the Western healthcare system, they perceive this to be a foreign body attack or some body reaction. Diagnosis. The African doctor will always say, "Who did this? Your child died. Who did it?" But then, in the Western side, what caused it? In fact, when the traditionalist asks that question, he wants to identify, he wants to punish, he wants to treat, he wants to cure, and he wants to prevent by protection. But the Western, they want to do all those things and prevent by education. Who are the prime practitioners? The diviner, or ngaka in Setswana, nyanga in Zulu, the herbalist, the spiritual healer. The traditionalist will also welcome the physician, the Western physician, as well as the Christian prayer. They got no problem. And for the Western, it's the physician and the nurse. What about the training? The traditional doctor is a doctor by divine calling. Sometimes they just collapse and they get into a trance, the job has begun. It's also, for the herbalist, it's intergenerational. In other words, the herbalist will say, "My uncle taught me this." And the Western healthcare, you have to spend some gruel in 7 years before you specialize. Specialization, this is another major difference. The traditional doctor has got all in one: counselor, doctor, educator, prophet, and Professor Aja Babalao. That's a famous Yoruba word, isn't it? He's also a herbalist, he's investigator. Who did it? He's the lawyer, arbitrator, uses the divination stick, bones, dreams, visions, stones, you name it. But with the Western, it is the stethoscope, X-ray laboratory. Mental illness. To the traditional doctor, this is possession by spirits, even though there may be some natural causes. And the Western, it's mental disorders. The Westerners are struggling with the idea that somebody may be demon-possessed, unless they are a doctor, like Dr. Siko, of course. What about the treatment and the prescription? There is hospitalization, there is outpatient, there is dancing to the ancestors, spiritual and appeasement, there's bleeding, we've heard about that, holy water, prayer, strings, cuttings, herbs, but the dosage is not measured. It's not consistent. Of course, they are aware. Even when they give you a dosage, they'll tell you, this one will kill you, don't eat too much. But there's no measurement. With the Westernization, more or less the same thing, but the patient has to receive specialist attention. And there is a strict dosage regimen there. The understanding and appreciation of these differences is a lead to cultural, 2 minutes? You did not tell me about the 5 minutes, so I'll grab the 3. Thanks. The cultural understanding and appreciation of these differences is a lead to cultural competency. Characteristics of the culturally competent healthcare provider are being cultural sensitive, cultural knowledge, showing cultural empathy, cultural relevance in relations and interactions, culturally appropriate healthcare delivery, culturally appropriate spiritual care. The outcomes: awareness of healthcare, providers' own culture. You need to know your culture in order to understand the other person's culture. Awareness and appropriately confronting medically dangerous beliefs. Instead of throwing the towel with the bath water, let's pick the useful stuff and help these people on their dangerous practices. Cultural consideration for minorities, and as well as cultural considerations for every patient and family. I'd like to make the following conclusions and recommendations. There are missiological challenges and implications to African traditional approaches to health and wholeness. Western and colonial gospel and health Western and colonial gospel and health work practices were seriously flawed in dealing with the local traditional healthcare system. Unfortunately, this still persists, even though there are signs of promising changes. Cultural ignorance, pride, cultural intolerance, in whatever form, whether it be religious, cultural, traditional, will always impact the gospel and health work negatively. I have the following recommendations. As we have seen, the world is fast becoming a global village. Cultural competency is essential for all gospel and health workers if the mission of God is to be enhanced. In its fundamental beliefs, the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church has shown recently cultural competency and sensitivity by adding the latest article which acknowledges the existence of powers of darkness that continue to dog the African traditionalists, including our church members. All professionals at institutions and churches need exposure to cultural competencies. Seminars need to consider including in their curriculum courses on cultural competence. And further, missiologists in tandem with systematic theologians and local churches need to research into the most biblical and appropriate theology of mission to other cultures. And finally, Adventist research needs to tap into the vast knowledge of useful drugs, herbs, that are used by traditional herbalists for improved pharmaceutical products. However, biopiracy, which is a new problem, needs to be avoided at all costs to avoid the depletion of these natural resources, as well as not to exploit the local communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. It's now time for questions and answers. If you have a question that you want to pose, this is the opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and it's a very much needed study. I have a question. As you were going through the practitioners of the traditional medicine, you did not quite mention the homeopaths. Would you classify them under the Western side or under the African side? The homeopaths. I remember I had two homeopath Adventists in my district when I was in pastoral work. And I observed them very closely, the kind of practice they were doing, and it was quite interesting. They did not really have so much of traditional, although they used herbs. And you did not quite mention a lot on herbs as well. So if you could just clarify for me this, practice. Thank you.
Yeah, my focus was mainly on the traditionalist, but the homeopaths, I don't know about Western medicine. They probably, it falls under complementary religion, medicine. And yes, I'll come to you, Dr. Sikwa. And in Africa, certainly they would fall under the traditional because they are not standard. Anything that is an alternative medicine needs to be considered in similar ways. Dr. Sikwa, you raised your hand because I think you want to chip in something, if you can allow me.
Yes, it's just on that one of homeopaths. Homeopathy historically is Western. It comes from the Western side. But the current classification on the homeopath, you find that is put under alternative in as much as it historically is Western. The modern day homeopaths, they, especially the African homeopath, tends to mix in with the herbs. But the original homeopath does not use even herbs. It actually originally uses water. And in its essence, it is more about the molecules and how they relate to each other when they're aggregated, and not so much about the herb or the drug or other things. So it will be more, it's alternative because it is kind of similar to like acupuncture. As you can see, acupuncture does not deal with herbs or Western. It is something that is totally different, and it's a different class of its own.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for this very enlightening presentation. I loved it, and I hope that I'll complement a few things later in my paper. You have given a very nice introduction for what I'm going to speak later, but I'd like to ask you a question here. Many members, as you mentioned, not only in Africa, but in places where healing is a holistic thing, after going to church, after worshiping God, and after serving God, if they have a situation, they have a crisis, they have a disease that's not healed, there's no cure, they will feel tempted to go back to the sorcery and witchcraft, and many of them go back. What would be your recommendation or counsel or any enlightenment in this situation that is happening right now with members who are part of the Adventist Church for many years. Whenever there's a crisis, they have that very strong temptation to go back for traditional healing, although they don't believe everything in traditional healing, but it's stronger than themselves. What recommendation will you give to a pastor in a local church in Africa?
Now, dual allegiance and syncretism is an enduring problem with our church members. One time when I was chaplain at Kanya Hospital, was also taking care of a small church of about 300 membership. And one day, a family came to me on Sabbath and say, "Pastor, we have a new plot. We want to start building. But our parents are putting pressure on us." They were not Adventists, the parents, that we should call the doctor to come and work on and give the yard protection. I said, what does the doctor do? He says, no, he comes, he goes to the corners and digs in some medicine there, and so forth. Then at the gate, there's some medicine, and then where we are going to. I said, okay, can we meet on Sunday at the plot? We went to the plot on Sunday. We did a little devotion there. Then we went to the four corners, just as I was told he does, and they were so happy. We prayed. They were so happy. I think we need to contextualize every situation. It's very hard to really prescribe what exactly needs to be done. But the secret, really, for our church members is to have them entrenched in their understanding of who God is and their faithfulness in God. Then we need to help them to trust God even in adverse situations. And I would like to appeal to systematic theologians and missiologists who already are in the making. We are really behind. We need some form of corpus so that can help us to work towards helping our church members to remain strong in the faith.
Thank you, Pastor, for this wonderful presentation. I believe that your presentation comes with a rich background of ministry and experience, especially from Africa and also from the West. And as I pose this question, I also bear in mind that we as a church, we have a very strong health message. And coupled with that, we also have institutions of health. And I believe that when we reflect on the institutions of health, basically as it is now, as far as I'm concerned, it is all about Western medicine. Because the lifestyle medicine, I think, was somehow forgotten along the path and was not emphasized as Ellen White intended it to be. That's my assumption. And especially if you look into Africa, you go into those cultural setups where you have the traditional medicine, you know, not necessarily the spiritism and all those kind of things. When I get home and probably I get some food poisoning, my mother would quickly go and pick up a herb and give me, you know, either boiled or you just chew, and the problem will go away. The Western medicine will always go for the diagnosis, what is the problem, and all the like, and give me a prescription. I'm just trying to ask myself, because you are talking in the light of mission, where do we create a balance of the two? I live here in Ayas, where you have about over 70 countries and nationalities, you know, represented. But I see a number of them have more of a similar African culture. You see a child is sick, they will walk along the fence here. And you see them with herbs very early in the morning, like my mother used to go and pick up herbs early in the morning, you know. And they will go either juice it or do something like that, or boil it, whatever it is, and give their children, they get better. Not even to the children, but the adults. And I'm glad that you quoted also, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little longer, Ezekiel 47, that talks about the healing, which is also reflected in the book of Revelation, chapter 22. I think this is verse 2, that says that the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Maybe this is talking about the Garden of Eden, but also the future paradise. So, as a church, as a minister who is called on mission, where do we create a balance? Because I know I cannot, if I'm in the US, I cannot even recommend a cucumber for you to eat to ease your acidity in the stomach, because there should not be a claim of any therapeutic value in food, according to FDA. I'm glad we have the doctor there also. So where do you create a balance? Here you are talking about lifestyle. You are taking us back to the Eden, but also we have the Western medicine along with us. So you definitely have a conflict as a minister. How do you deal with it on the ground? Sorry, it has been a long statement. Thank you.
All right. Your question is like somebody who is wanting to drink coconut water. It's deep in there. My brother, when 2 days ago, we got some fresh coconut milk and cream, and out of my excitement about the health benefits of coconut milk and cream and water, I took a cup, like teacup, of coconut cream, and my wife suggested some ideas about it and tried to discourage me. I said, no, I'm going for it. It was in the night. So I drank that cup. And some of you have had the experience. It wasn't a good night. It was a night of diarrhea. As I was doing the diarrhea, I wasn't thinking of Dr. Almosera. I didn't want to disturb her. But I was thinking, is there somebody who is traditional who can help me stop this? You know, the thing is, the answers are in the experience. The answers are in the learning. When you come to a new place like that, you cannot just jump into the healing methods that they have, but you go through the experience. We work first, take precautions with your doctors, and get close to the people that are practicing those things. I must apologize that in my presentation, I did not include any quote from Ellen G. White. That does not mean I'm not pro Ellen G. White, but since I'm going to do a complete paper, I promise that I will include it. So essentially, the balance is difficult. You've got to be informed by research. You need to study for yourself and find out from medical doctors. And usually, I think the medical doctors are encouraging that before you partake of any of these alternative medicine, consult the doctor. And of course, in many cases, they will caution you against it or to be careful.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof, for that wonderful presentation. I hope we can give him a round of applause. Now let's wait for the next presentation.
Can I remove this? I don't know how to eject it.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I introduce the next presenter, I would like to request everyone please to stand up. We've been sitting for long. Just want you to stretch a little bit because the next presenter is coming all the way from Zimbabwe and is a man of action. So let's just stretch a little bit and have some moments of exercise before Pastor Woodson Biriri comes to present. You may take your seat by now. I would like to introduce our speaker, our presenter, Pastor Woodson Biriri. Is a PhD candidate in the Old Testament. If we want to have an event, a live event, make sure you call him, because he's a man who can manipulate words and construct things. We youth from the campus, we call him Pastor's Youth. He's our youth pastor, but he's not an ordained youth pastor in this area here. But we wish when he's go back to Zimbabwe, they might use him mightily with the youth. He is married with one wife, Mrs. Dr. Biriri, Alaisa Biriri, and his topic will be in Israel's health laws in light of ancient Near Eastern health practice, a comparative approach. Pastor Woodson, this is your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate also the previous presentation. Very amazing indeed. It really speaks to concrete issues that do take place in our continent. Many things were going through my mind as I was listening to Dr. Gabasiane's presentation. Now, for this time, this is like a build-up on the presentation that I made yesterday, talking on which was focusing on dimensions of health in the Old Testament. And the key word that we came up with from that is shalom, which is totality of well-being, when everything is in a state of equilibrium and there's nothing that can be improved on that. And building on that, some elements of that will also filter into our presentation, or my presentation this morning. And this morning, I'm going to take us back in time to the times of the Bible, and we are going to try and look at Israel's health laws in light of ancient Near Eastern health practices, a comparative approach. There's still, when I started this project or this study, I was hoping many questions would be answered, but many questions came up along the way, which I do not have answers for. And so, as we do that, we find that studying the Bible, or the study of the Bible, has been greatly benefited by discoveries in archaeology. Many discoveries that have been made, which have enhanced our appreciation of many aspects of the Bible. So many things have been unearthed in the Bible lands and in the Near East, in Egypt, which have made it possible for us to gain a new appreciation of many things that otherwise we would continue to be puzzled by in the Hebrew Bible, for example. Such as we now have comparative creation accounts or stories about how the world came into existence, cosmogonies, and then law codes. That we now have prophecy, like from Mary. We now know about how the prophets in Mary used to operate. History, we have quite a wealth of information now from, for example, of course, from Egypt, from Syria, and also from Babylon and Assyria. Because palaces of ancient kings have been exhumed, such kings as Sennacherib, Shalmaneser, Sargon II, and all these, and their libraries. So we have quite a lot of information, and in some of these, we have direct mention of kings, Israelite kings, who are also mentioned in the Bible. And so we then gain an outsider perspective, extra biblical perspective into some of these events. wisdom literature, some of us might have heard of like the Babylonian Job. Many of us, of course, would know the story of Job just from the Bible, but we have parallel accounts or narratives of the same. Even in the study of languages, our appreciation has been enhanced by looking at even how they were writing and the changes that were taking place in language and so on. Now, this has to do with background. I wanted this for an illustration, but I could not get the original picture as I got it. But Dr. Sokupa definitely would see there's a difference between what it was like when he sent it and what it looks like. There's a difference in the background. The background was black when this picture first came, but this is another background. It's just blank, it's just white, and it brings the image into sharp focus. That is my point. With the change of background, the image comes into sharp focus, and then it's clearer picture. It becomes a clearer picture. Now, this is what these discoveries do for us. What archaeologists brought for us helps us to have the Bible in clearer focus, some of the things that we read about in the Bible, because when the Bible was written, many of these things did not need to be elaborated on. They didn't need to explain a lot because it was common knowledge, but it's no longer common knowledge for us. And hence, when we have these kind of findings, they really enhance, they illuminate on the Bible. So this is a comparative approach. Now, I'm using this graphic here to try and put across the idea of what's on my mind when you're talking about this. So we are looking at the Bible through two lenses here. One is the ancient lens of what used to happen in the surrounding nations to Israel in the ancient past. And then also the other lens of these spectacles is like the modern health sciences and practices. I'm not strong in that area, but I'm glad we have doctors and other medical practitioners here who could also help us, because there are questions actually that I have in the study here. And so we find that these discoveries that have been made in the ancient Near East have helped us appreciate quite a lot. And now, focusing on the Torah, my study is delimited to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That is from Genesis to Deuteronomy. That is where we have some laws that have to do with health, Israel's health practices. And these are the ones that we are very much interested in for this morning. And so we find there, we have a collection of laws, over 600 of them, and the laws regulate in so many areas of life. These laws that we find in the Pentateuch. And so, focus is on this small section that seem to have something to do with health. Okay? And I'm saying that in a qualified sense, because in the concept of shalom, health is all-encompassing. But I have like a bias toward health in its physiological and anatomical sense, so that we try and find somewhere where we can gain a foothold and then confront the subjects that we have with before us. And so focus is on this. In other words, number one, what health laws are there in the Pentateuch? Are there health laws? And if they are, what are they? How are they organized? In other words, what do you call it? Taxonomy or whatever. How they're organized. And then, how do these compare to ancient Near Eastern laws? These are basically the 3 questions that are orienting my presentation this morning. So, we find that we have some laws that seem to talk about, in fact, that are focused on diet, human diet, that is. And these regulations begin with the creation accounts. When God created Adam and Eve, he gave the first 3 commands or instructions were, number 1, make sure you have lots of babies. Okay? And fill the earth. Of course, some people have taken it as a personal project and so on, and that's good. That's good. Make sure you have lots of babies, fill the whole place. And number 2, have dominion over the earth, and this can relate to environmental health or ecology and things like that. And number 3, they were given a prescribed diet. The diet that was prescribed for them was plant-based diet. And these same laws were actually repeated or reiterated after the flood in the exact same order to Noah and his sons. God repeated the same instructions in the exact same order. And it is quite interesting here, maybe beginning right here, to note that this command is contrary to ancient Near Eastern worldview, because in the ancient Near East, we have got many flood stories, the Gilgamesh epic and Enuma Elish, and all so on and so on. In those stories, the gods actually destroy the world because they are irritated by the multiplying populations of humanity and the noise that they are making, which is disturbing the gods when they are having their siesta. And so the gods decide, okay, let's just get rid of all these people. So this is actually revolutionary, because the account in the Bible is saying God is pleased to have people multiply. But the ancient Near Eastern gods are irritated by people becoming many, in population growth. So they regulate it through a flood. And then, so they are annoyed by humans. And out of this, we also have this statement that may you have dominion and so on. In the ancient Near East, this was a preserve only for the kings. But right here, it's actually given to everyone, that they have dominion. This is a royal language that is used here. So, in other words, God is treating all human beings like they are royal. So, this is very different. And we would not see this if we didn't know what the alternative is. So, it enhances our appreciation. After the flood, these same instructions were repeated. And so, there's something here that I would just like to mention. There's something I wanted to include here. But in the flood story that we find in the Gilgamesh, story of Gilgamesh, we hear that when the gods got annoyed with the growing human population and they ordered a flood, they destroyed, later on the gods were sorry because there was no one to take care of their needs, particularly to feed them. And so they got so hungry, so much that when the flood water subsided and then this man got out of the ark and he offered his sacrifice, it's almost just like the story of Genesis. The account says that the gods swarmed that sacrifice like flies because they were so hungry. They were so hungry. And so what we find is that in the ancient Near Eastern stories, it is unthinkable that the gods could create humans and give them food. Humans are created to give the gods food. So it is the other way around. In the Bible, God creates humans and prescribes food. But in the ancient Near Eastern accounts, humans are created so that gods might have food. So it's the other way around. So they, and then of course we have a vegan diet that is given by God to these humans when they were first created. But in the parallel accounts that we have, we find that one of the stories about a god called Enki, he actually gives flesh foods. There's no mention of any plant foods that is given to the humans when they were first made or created. And they are only given that food so that they can have enough strength to supply the gods with the food that they need. So that is the kind of, it's a totally different scenario that we get. And then we've got distinction, that is, okay, and then there's the mention in the Hebrew Bible of the clean and unclean foods. So certain foods, so there's prescribed food, and then there's proscribed food. Proscribed, that means prohibited. Food that, things that God says, this is not food, don't eat. And that includes unclean animals. Now, maybe the long story short here is this. scholars have struggled with why did God recommend or give some animals, or as you can eat these, but you cannot or you should not eat these ones. It has not been easy to try and find a rationale, because the reason is not provided in the Bible. We only first hear of the mention of unclean animals in Genesis chapter 7 verse 2, when Noah is taking the animals onto the ark. That is the first time that language is used. And it assumes Noah already knew there's a distinction, but when the distinction is made, we do not have a record of that. And then we also find that this is expanded on by the listings that are given in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 of clean and unclean animals. And there's, as Roy Gain mentions, there's no rationale that is provided as to, and because of this, a lot of suggestions have been brought, and one is the aesthetic explanation. So this scholar here says that, well, those animals which God said don't eat, I mean, even for anyone, when you look at those, I mean, they are not so appetizing anyway. They are not pleasant to the sight. So, I mean, who would want to eat that anyway? So some people say maybe that's why God didn't want them to be eaten. Some people have said, well, they've given theological reasons. The animals which God provided as unclean were the same ones associated with pagan religions. There are challenges to this suggestion because it cannot be all true. And then there are health explanations. So some people have said that, and this includes Maimonides, the ancient Israelite philosopher from the 12th century. He is buried in Israel. I remember we passed by his grave, but at that time I really didn't know who he was and how significant he was, so we didn't bother much to stop by, but we just saw the grave. Later on I got to know who he was. Very important figure indeed. So some people say, well, those animals is because they are detrimental to health. This is actually what Maimonides says, and there are many other scholars who are of the same view. And then there are some who have an ecological approach that maybe God just wanted to limit the number of animals that would be killed, so that, I mean, at least when humans would eat, they would not kill all of them. And then there's this anthropologist, that is Mary Douglas, and she says that the animals which are listed as unclean is because of, they are actually anomalous. They're anomalous. They are sort of like disordered. Some of them, they live on land and in water and everything. You don't really know where they belong. Like the bird, is it a bird? Is it a mammal? Is it, I mean, is it where does it belong? You know, this is what she's saying. So it says, because of this anomalous kind of nature of these animals, they therefore are declared unclean and they are not supposed to be eaten. So it is still an ongoing thing to try and ascertain why. But it seems like the three last reasons, that is the health explanation, and then the ecological, and this issue of wholeness in relating to the concept of shalom, our answer could lie somewhere there in this, especially coming to the health reason or argument, especially considering that many of the animals are also like scavengers. They are also they are scavenging animals. So probably there could be a reason there. And then, so talking about the ancient Near East, there is no prescribed animals in terms of the human diet, whether in Babylon, in Mesopotamia or Egypt. It's only localized prescriptions, like in certain regions where people say we don't eat this animal for their own local reasons there, but their neighbors within the same country actually do eat and so on. So there are no wholesale prescriptions such as we find here in the Hebrew Bible. We say this whole list, never eat. It's not a temporary prohibition. No, is it a local one? It's a permanent and seems universal. So this is very different, okay? And seems like, okay. And then So we have got all these kind of reasons, and then blood is also not supposed to be eaten. And the reason given in the Hebrew Bible is that because that is what life is. The life of the animal is in the blood. So blood is almost synonymous with life. And whether there's anything detrimental in eating blood, detrimental to human health, that is physiologically, I'm not sure, and I didn't find anything in literature that would support that kind of view. But it seems what I find is suggestions that have been made by scholars to the effect that since blood is synonymous with life, eating blood would be like a flagrant disregard for life. And hence, by giving this kind of instruction, God is, while humans can have been given the permission to eat flesh foods, but they are still reminded of the sanctity of life through this inhibition or prohibition. They are still reminded of the sanctity of life. And then, but we also have fat prohibited, it's prohibited. Do not eat fat. And there's not much reason that is given in comparison to blood that in the Hebrew Bible. So fat, they're just told, do not eat fat. But from a modern scientific view, we know that animal fat can wreak havoc with our systems, like particularly the cardiovascular system, and could be linked to any number of conditions, perhaps including things like type 2 diabetes. So we have this. Now, we find that according to Aristias, a 1st century Egyptian Jew, asserted that dietary laws are ethical since abstention from the, I think I've already stated this. So prescription of blood consumption was meant to heighten their sense of respect for life. Now, in ancient Near Eastern literature, as I've said earlier on, humans are created to give food to the gods, not the other way around. Humans were created to supply food, and then the gods destroyed humans in a flood. I went ahead of myself and stated this as well. So what we have is a unique situation. When we look into the Hebrew Bible, we may not see it, reading it in the 21st century, but when it was read in its time, it was revolutionary. In light of what we now know, from what we've discovered from the surrounding regions, it was revolutionary. The picture that we see is of a God who is so close to his people and very much concerned with every aspect of their being and existence. And in that sense, really concerned with all matters pertaining to their health. And so, the Israelites had a very unique God and a unique experience. And so, I'm going to try and move faster here, so that we find here issues relating to substance abuse. The long and short of this, God told the Israelites no to alcohol. In the book of Leviticus, do not drink, Leviticus chapter 10, don't drink. And this was given directly to the priests. And it seems like Nadab and Abihu were drunk when they lit the strange fire in the sanctuary, so their judgment was not proper, and they did something wrong. They died on the spot. But what we need to know is that in the ancient Near East, the gods, whenever they have feasts, and I'm mentioning this, we have so many records now here in the library that tell us about all this. When these ancient Near Eastern gods, the Babylonian gods, the Assyrian gods, when they would have their parties, different foods are listed, and what you will find never missing is beer or alcoholic beverages. And actually the gods would get so drunk, and some of them would murder fellow gods. There was so much jealousy and politics among the gods in the pantheons. And they would murder fellow gods and humans were created out of a god who had been murdered in a drunken party. In the ancient Near Eastern stories or myths. And then we also find Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. He was actually elected by, unanimously by gods when they were drunk. And then they chose him to be the chief of the gods. And then they decided that they were going to build Babylon as Marduk's city. These are the stories. And so, what we find here, God tells Israelites no to alcohol. But to these other people, alcohol is actually what their gods celebrate with. So if the gods themselves are getting drunk, can you imagine what was happening to the societies? And then in light of what we now know of what alcohol does physiologically and in society and things like that, we can then better appreciate what God spared the Israelites from by telling them not to drink alcohol. And then there are also maternal issues when God tells to the Israelites